I'm Mo. It is May, and finally the sun is shining. You can tell from my sweater that it is still quite cold. I don't know what the weather's doing this year. It's just like we skipped spring and it's still winter, but it's like summer winter or spring winter where everything's blooming and everything's beautiful, but it's cold out and it's rainy half the time. So hopefully starting now it'll like really warm up and it'll really be spring, and then all of a sudden it'll be summer and then it'll be fall again, and you know how it goes. But I'm hoping that over this vlog, which is going to be another monthly vlog, that I can maybe take you out and show you a little bit of my neighborhood and take you around to see the progression of spring in the area of the United States where I live. I've been doing these monthly readathons and I've really enjoyed vlogging my experience. Vlogging for me really needs a purpose. I'm not good at kind of daily vlogging, probably because I don't really do much during the day, or I don't really do much day to day. I don't lead a very exciting life, which is totally fine by me. I'm very happy about that, but it doesn't make for very exciting booktube videos. The monthly reading vlogs and the monthly readathons help me accomplish two things. They help me make some vlogs for you and then also stick with my readathon, which is awesome. So I have done a booktube spin vlog and I have done a linguathon vlog, and this month, for the month of May, I'm going to be participating in the 1900 to 1950 readathon that was created by Books and Things. I really like this readathon, and I really like readathons like this that are month-long and that have very simple prompts, maybe not too many prompts. The linguathon had 9 prompts, which was kind of a lot, but I thought that was perfect. This one has 6 prompts, and it really gives you a wide variety. You can really choose a lot of things to do, and you can choose things that are already on your TBR, and so it's really, really fun and accessible and hopefully, ideally, easy to accomplish. For this readathon, the goal is to read books from the 1900s to 1950. You're supposed to pick books from each decade, so 1900 to 1910, 1911 to 1920, 1921 to 1930, 1931 to 1940, 1941 to 1950. The prompts for this readathon are: read a book from your country, read a book from a different country than yours, read a genre classic, so you know, mystery, thriller, spy, fantasy, sci-fi, whatever you want. Read a non-novel, so like poetry or a play. The 5th prompt is read a book set during World War I or World War II. So those are the 5 official prompts, and then there's a bonus prompt, but I think that this bonus prompt really kind of makes this readathon and might be the one I'm most excited for, which is read 1 book from each decade. So I really like that idea. I'm planning to hit all 6 if I can. And I've done something a little bit different with this readathon where I have actually made a TBR. I don't usually make TBRs. This is some of my favorite eras for books, and there's just so much potential that you could do there. And after reading some more modern books or contemporary books this year so far, I'm happy to get back into my comfort zone. I only have 4 books so far planned for this readathon, and I am already reading the first one, so I'll talk about that one last. For the prompt of a non-novel and for the prompt that fits during World War I or World War II, I picked up this short, really slim Dover edition of World War I British poets. This was in a free little library, and I didn't know about this readathon before picking this up, so I picked this one up first. I was just really interested to read it. It's extremely short. I don't read a lot of poetry, and I don't read a lot about World War I. I picked up Passing by Nella Larson earlier this year, and I just haven't gotten to it yet, and I figured that this was the perfect time to get to it. This fits the prompt for for book from my country because Nella Larson was American. She was part of the Harlem Renaissance of writers. Her book is extremely influential, but I feel like has gone kind of untalked about for a long time until more recently. I think with like Britt Bennett's The Vanishing Half and a few other books kind of that have to do with colorism and race and passing for a different race, this one has kind of been brought back into the forefront, and I'm really, really interested to read it. I've never read any Nella Larson before, and I'm excited. Then I have a book that I recently picked up from the Habitat for Humanity Restore, and this is Out of Africa by Isak Dinesen or Karen Blixen. This is a very cool copy. I love it. I really, really enjoy the movie of Out of Africa. I don't think it is quite accurate to the book, but I've never read any Isak Dinesen, and I've always been really, really intrigued by her story. I've always wanted to read her work, so when I saw this, I was like, oh, this is great. This is by far the longest book on my TBR so far for this month. It is over 400 pages, almost 420 pages, and you know how I do with books that are that long, but the text is really big, and I think I'll be able to get through it. I am excited. I feel like this is my and Isak Dinesen's time to get to know each other. The last book that I'm going to talk about, but the first book that I'm actually reading for this readathon is The Loved One by Evelyn Waugh. In my last vlog, I totally butchered that name, and I also gave some misinformation. I thought that Evelyn Waugh was a kind of bridge between classic and modern classic writers, but in truth, he was just a British modern classic writer. So he wrote Brideshead Revisited. So he's also kind of cultural specific. Like, I feel like a lot of Americans don't know Brideshead Revisited, but a lot of British people do, obviously. I started it last night, and I've only got a little bit of the way in, so the next update I'll give you, I'll let you know more about what it's about. In the first chapter, I don't know what it's about. I have no idea. There is a cemetery on the front, and it is reportedly very, very dark and bleak. So that is 4 out of the 5 prompts, and 4 out of the 5, hopefully, books I will read this month for this readathon. I have yet to find a book from 1900 to 1910. Are you participating in this readathon? If you are, let us know in the comments below what books you're reading for this readathon, and I will see you when I read more of The Loved One. For the 1900 to 1950 readathon, I also wanted to show you a little bit of spring and how spring is shaping up in my neck of the woods. It is quite a bit of a late spring this year. It's only now starting to get warm, and it's about mid-May. You can hear the kids screaming. We live near a elementary school. I wanted to talk today about The Loved One. I am almost finished with this. I'm at page 116, and I love this book so far. I'm really enjoying it. It is a satire, a satirical look at the business of death. It's a look at kind of film industry, the American importance on film and the arts. Our main character, Barlow, is an expat. He is British living in America, and he has failed in the eyes of his other expats. In the first chapter, all of these people who know each other and who work in the film industry gather together and are drinking whiskey and enjoying each other's company, which is a normal thing that they do, a thing that they do quite often, and they're saying how it's a pity about Barlow because he couldn't make it in the film industry, he couldn't make it in Hollywood. He has now lowered himself to beyond low, being an American, and he has started working at a pet mortuary. He goes when a pet dies and collects them, makes the funeral arrangements, and interns these pets. Barlow is finding that he really enjoys his job. He's a poet and never really took to Hollywood, and he's hoping to find some inspiration and creativity through his work. I don't want to give too much of this book away because it is very, very short and it is really fun and fast-paced, and I really, really like it. It's definitely very dark. It has a lot of death in it. It has animal death in it, although so far that animal death has been quite gentle. There is a lot to do with mortuaries and a lot to do with funeral homes and a lot to do with cemeteries, which are all things that I actually really enjoy. I didn't have a lot of death to deal with, but I had friends who dealt with death at a very young age, and I remember going to the funerals, and it was almost like a regular occurrence for them to have to go to funerals and have to think about death a lot. And we had this idea that we wanted to start a funeral home one day, to have a career in a funeral home one day, and to have a funeral home, and so we were going to call it Bury Me Deep. My friends lived next to a cemetery for a while, and we would often play in the cemetery. We did some of our school projects in church grounds that had cemeteries. So death was definitely a common theme, and I think that's probably why I don't shy away from death as much as many people, and kind of spending time in funeral homes or spending time in churches or spending times in cemeteries. I would not actually want to have a mortuary in real life, and I don't think I wanted to have one when I was a kid either, but it was a fun way to kind of make light of you know, a very heavy and dark situation, and to put yourself in the shoes of the people around you. Very much like a young person thing to do, to think about what a career is and what a job is and how people do that work and what that work is. So that is definitely, this book is definitely making me think of that. This book is definitely a little bit flowery. It's a little bit, I would say, what people would call purple prose. Our main character is a poet, so it's got a lot of that kind of lyrical writing to it as well. I've never read any Evelyn Waugh, but after this I'm like super excited to read some other things. Yesterday I walked around a couple of gardens and took some clips of that for you. Those gardens are in downtown Asbury Park, and they are very, very nice. We are so lucky where we live to have gardens and parks and water features, rivers and lakes. They maintain them really well in the city, and so it's a pleasure to go and see those things even on a cloudy day like yesterday was. I'm going to finish The Loved One, and I'll check back in with you when I've read some more. I finished The Loved One by Evelyn Waugh. I really enjoyed this book. I like that it was a look at kind of life and death and the idea of expatriates living in California and the kind of silliness of how America looks at England and England looks at America. So England, you know, looks down at America and thinks they're stupid, and anyone who would want to become native and be an American are stupid, and how we make ourselves feel better with funerals, and how that business looks and could look in a kind of not too distant, slightly dystopian future. It was a really interesting book. I really enjoyed it. It also had a lot to do with relationships of people and the kind of meeting of cultures of British and American, and how that romance might not work out. I liked that it was kind of like a semi-dystopian look from 1948 to a not too distant, not too different future, how dating might appear. It was interesting how the pressures of society and the pressures of failure and your specific culture and what your culture considers as failure might make you make drastic decisions. So there is a British person, and he kind of sees his dismissal from the movie industry as a deep failure, and rather than returning to England or finding another job, he feels washed up and ends up committing suicide. And then there is a young lady who is unlucky in love and can't quite get a hold of the right man and the right path that she's supposed to take. It's interesting, the idea of how death could be and always is the ultimate answer to everything. I really love this book. And then the next book that I have to talk about, Out of Africa, this book is a nonfiction memoir of Karen Blixen, or Isak Dinesen as her pen name was, who was a Danish woman who married and moved to Africa. She lived in Africa for 20-some years. Their marriage ended up falling apart, but what she gained from that was her life and time in Africa. They had a coffee plantation together, and when they divorced, he left, and she ended up taking over the plantation and working it on her own. It's about her relationship with the land of Africa and the land near Nairobi where her farm was. She had like 600 acres or something huge. It's post-colonized, pre-Kenya Africa. It takes place in the 19-teens, 1920s, and 1930s, and the book was written in 1938. It's about her plantation and how she learned to grow coffee in an inhospitable area. It's about the relationships that she had and the relationships that she made there. So there are kind of some main characters that are African, her servants and helpers who became her friends, people who lived on her farm who were considered squatters, but obviously had that land before she did. And it's also about some British people who live in Africa and become close with her, some people who end up becoming lovers, and some people who end up becoming friends, an old man who dies on her farm and her property. It's interesting that both these books that I'm reading for Linguathon have to do with expats and how they dealt with the extremely different cultures in the countries that they end up living in. So, written in 1948 and a very satirical, disturbing look at America, and written in 1938 and a very poignant, sweet, lyrical look at Africa. The movie is much more of a love story between these two people, and it's much more Hollywood and, again, a funny connection. It's much more Americanized kind of version of her life. I'm only about a fourth of the way through, but Out of Africa is a love story, but it's her love story with Africa and with her farm and where she lived and what she did and the people and how she became aligned and attuned with the indigenous people that lived on her property. So I haven't gotten to the character that becomes the love story in the movie, but so far it's really beautiful. I've tried to read this book a couple of times and I haven't gotten into it, but I am definitely into it now, and I'm excited that this readathon helped me get there. Another book that I want to talk briefly about, I'm also reading at the same time, which is World War I British Poets. So this book was published in 1997, but it contains poems that were written by famous and non-famous poets during the First World War. I'm not a huge poetry fan, so I'm already kind of finding it difficult to get through this extremely small book. And we also know I'm not a big fan about reading about the wars. These were poems that were written during the war. Some of these poets went on to become famous for these poems that were written about the war, and some of them were famous already and went to war and returned from war. I will say that most of the poems I've read so far, the men did not return from war. They were killed in World War I. Some of them are pro-war and some of them are anti-war. Some of them think that England was in the right to be in World War I, and some of them see it as a very futile and death-filled waste of time. Over May, I'm going to make my way through this one, and I'm going to finish Out of Africa, and I will check in with you when I read some more. So it's a lot further on in May, and I have finished Out of Africa. Honestly, it's been like a week and a half since I checked in on this vlog, so I can't remember what I said about it, but I loved that this story was not told in a strictly linear fashion. I love that this story was told in kind of 3 sections in my mind. It has more than 3 sections in the book, but in my mind it's 3 sections after reading it. It's the first section where she kind of introduces the farm and the people on the farm and how the farm works and how those people fit into the farm and how she fits into the farm. And then the second section is kind of these little vignettes and stories and memories of her time on the farm, little things that happened, animals that were there, little instances, little adventures that she went on. And then the last section is about her leaving the farm. So she goes to this farm and she's kind of an alien there early on, but she so quickly becomes enamored of the farm and in love with the farm and in love with Africa, and she never pictures herself leaving Africa, and she never imagines herself being anywhere else. And after 30 years she is forced to leave Africa and sell the farm and lose the farm. Since there are Native Africans who live on the farm, she has to find new places for them. Since there are people who work for her, who have worked for her for so long and expect of her, she has to figure out their lives and help them move on. Since she is so much attached to the farm, she has to figure out a way to move on as well. And she has relationships all throughout Nairobi and all throughout Africa that she has to kind of close up and wrap up. And ultimately that is what the end of the book is. It's not only her leaving the farm and leaving Africa, but it's leaving her like life and her vitality and everything she thought she was going to have. So it's absolutely heartbreaking. I mean, I cried and cried at the end of this book. I think the way that it's written in such a familiar and almost diary-like episodes makes you feel very close. You're kind of pushed into the story right away. You're forced to just figure out what's going on, to come to a realization of her living in Africa without like a long back history and a long transition period. And, you know, that's kind of how she was as well. So you feel very closely to her, and it's very beautifully written, and a lot of it is factual, but also it's all told from her perspective. So a lot of it has just this feeling of her. So leaving the farm has this feeling of her. So when she's leaving the farm at the end of the book, you are also leaving the farm, and you're going to have to leave this beautiful place behind. And she's so devastated by it that it becomes extremely heartbreaking to read. I absolutely love this book. Obviously, it was written in 1937. There's quite a few problematic elements. The English people living in Nairobi, living in Ngong, living in Kenya are obviously very, terrible. They definitely think that Africa belongs to them. They see the native tribes as a nuisance. They prohibit their activities and their celebrations and their religions. They convert them to Catholicism or Christianity. They treat them extremely poorly. I think that Karen Blixen tries not to do that, and I think that an underlying theme of this book is that although obviously she is Danish and English, she really tries to communicate and lead the native tribes and live with the native tribes on their terms as much as possible. That's a lot to, 1937, that's a lot to buck. That's a big system to try to subvert or work around colonialism and British rule, but I think she really does. Obviously, there are some very insensitive things in this book. There are some problematic things in this book. I think that this book is very honest and earnest, and I think she tries to do the best she can with her background and her learning and her experience for the people who have a totally different background and learning and experience. It's hard to read about the oppression of these Native Africans and where they live and how how the land that they live on, they've lived on for generations, but it is taken away from them just because white people come in and are like, no, this is mine now. You're natives, you're heathens, you don't deserve it. She tries to come to that community and society and that different culture with an open mind and with the understanding that their culture is just as important as her own. And then I have been reading more of World War I British poets. This is so hard to get through. I mean, obviously it's about war, and it's written about death, and it's written about destruction, and it's written about grief, and it's just been really, really hard. I'm actually just about halfway through at the moment, and I've just been reading a couple of poems when I get a chance, and a couple of pages. I find the most interesting part of this book so far to be the biographies of the poets and what their relationship with the war was, whether they were pro-war, whether they were anti-war, whether they started out pro-war and became anti-war, whether they were long-term poets or they were only poets who wrote about the war and that's how they became famous and then subsequently died in the war. I'm reading it for this readathon and I'm finishing it for this readathon, but if it weren't for this readathon, I would definitely DNF it. I would read all the biographies and then I would DNF it. I did find a book and order a used book that should be coming soon, I hope, fingers crossed, that falls into the 1910s. It is quite summery here now. The weather has drastically changed. It is now quite hot and sunny and summery, and we are just racing towards Memorial Day, which in my neck of the woods is just a big deal because that's when our season starts, that's when the beaches open, that's when the tourists flood in, and I'm not really looking forward to that aspect. I think this summer is going to be a wild time, but whereas in the beginning of this vlog we had kind of still wintry weather and very, very cold weather, now we are towards the end of this vlog and it is pretty much summer. I'm in the middle of so many vlogs. I'm also vlogging my booktube spin, which you'll see after this vlog, and May's almost over, so I'm gonna probably start a June reading vlog. Oh my gosh. It is so hot out right now. It's like 75 degrees, but it is like really blazing hot. The sun just went into the clouds, but it's been really nice and hot, and spring is definitely over and summer is here already. I was able to finish World War I British poems. What a downer. I'm really glad I read it, and I'm really glad that I had the experience. I'm not a fan of poetry in general, and I'm not a fan of wars, and this was super hard to get through. It was only 71 pages, but it took me quite a long time. My favorite part of this book was that for each poet, there is a biography of them, and it tells you when they were writing poems, what they were doing in the war, and if they survived the war or not. It felt very dated too. There was a lot of like rhyming poetry, and there was a lot of like fitting into certain rhythms. I guess having read a little bit more modern poetry feels a little silly in a way, but I'm glad I read it. I definitely dog-eared quite a few pages of poems that I enjoyed, and I do plan on taking some photos of them and keeping them. Ultimately, I don't plan on keeping this book at the end of the year. My next read for the 1900s-1950 readathon is going to be Passing by Nella Larsen, and so I'm going to get started on that one, and I'll let you know when I've read some more. And I have actually read all of Passing by Nella Larsen. Passing is about two friends who come from outside of the Chicago area. They live in a small town where it is a mostly black town, but the people there are very light-skinned, and some of them are so light-skinned that they can pass for white. Irene and Claire grew up together, were friends, were both very light-skinned, and then Claire's Claire's father died and she was taken to the white side of town by relatives. Her friend group kind of loses track of her and kind of forget about her. And then years and years later, Irene sees her on a visit to Chicago, and seeing her again and seeing that she's passing for white entirely kind of changes the course of Irene's life. This was a really interesting novel. I've never read a book about passing entirely before, but it is very much in the fore right now with Brit Bennett's The Vanishing Half and with some other books that have been written recently that are kind of similar and along similar themes. Nella Larson was writing in the 20s. She's part of the Harlem Renaissance. She's written a couple of other books along similar themes like Quicksand. This is the first book I've read by her. It's very, very short. It's just over 100 pages. I think it's like 115, 116 pages. It's told in an interesting way. So the first kind of chapter is her getting a letter from Claire, so you're kind of in the present, and then she remembers back to seeing Claire at this Chicago hotel. So Irene is black, has married a black man, and is very fond and protective of her race and her racial identity. But she does let people think that she's white when it benefits her. So, for instance, she would never have been in this hotel except that people accept that she's white and don't question that she might be black, because this is a time when obviously black people could not be in the same hotel restaurants as white people. Claire has completely lived a white life. She's married a extremely racist white man, and she has shunned every black person that she knows and every black person that she comes in contact with for fear that her blackness might be revealed. Then you kind of have this long section of the book that is Irene flashing back to meeting her in the hotel and the subsequent meetings that they have and how she finds out about Claire's past and about Claire's life since they were children. It's crazy because the first part is like doo-doo-doo, and then when you meet Claire, you meet her husband, and he is horrible. He's using the N-word all the time, and it becomes like very shocking, racist incident, very upsetting to Irene. You're very shocked and unsettled as well, and then you kind of come back to the present. The next part of the novel is, again, kind of, it's set in like the present, and it's kind of her and Claire's relationship after getting the second letter. So now Irene is in New York, and Claire comes to New York, and they kind of continue this relationship that Irene's not 100% comfortable with because Claire is in such a tenuous place in her life, and she doesn't want to cause Claire any issues, but she also doesn't want any issues in her life either. And then the end, which I won't spoil, is also quite shocking. So there's this kind of lull of figuring out what's going on, and then a very shocking moment in the beginning, and then there's this kind of lull and figuring out what's going on, and then this very shocking moment at the end. I definitely liked the lull part more than I liked the shocking moments. I liked Nella Larson's writing a lot more in those areas. The kind of shocking moments come with a kind of fugue of speech and memory and thought that I didn't love reading. I much preferred a much more linear, simple, simply written story. Definitely want to read more Nella Larson. She also did this thing that I hate, and it's just a personal thing. It has nothing to do with anything. Most people love this, but there is that point where the way she's writing, you know something bad is going to happen, building you up, and the characters kind of don't realize it, and so you have all this suspense and you have all this anticipation, and I just hate that feeling. I don't like adrenaline. I don't like that anticipating feeling of knowing something bad is going to happen and having to watch the characters realize that. I don't like it in movies, and I don't like it in books. So there was definitely a part pre the end of this book that I got that feeling, and I was like, ugh, like I just don't want to read it. I don't like it. I would rather just like skip. I think I've talked about this before on my channel. I'm just not into that. Highly recommend this book. I'm super excited to read Brit Bennett's The Vanishing Half after reading this. I was not that interested in that, but I'm so interested to see how much of it pulls from this book. I finished passing, and I started The Book of Tea by Okakura Kakuzo. I was having a lot of trouble finding a book written in the 1900 to 1910 time period. So I went online and I looked at a bunch of books, and this was the one that really kind of spoke to me. I just started this one and I've only gotten past the first chapter, but so far this is very much like an instruction manual, a historic account, and a philosophy book. It talks in the first chapter about tea and how the Asian societies regard tea and where tea came from, and how the British kind of co-opted tea and colonized many of the Asian societies and took tea with them, and kind of how in Japan they might say you have too much tea, which would be that you're too vital and wild and, you know, you have a wild hair kind of idea, or you have no tea, which means that you're kind of dull and boring and that you need something to kind of spice you up. And it talks a little bit about East versus West and why Western culture finds Eastern culture so hard to understand, and yet they understand tea. So why is it so difficult kind of to understand, you know, Japan and India and China? If you understand tea, you should understand that. So far I really like it. It is a translated work. It's very simple, measured language so far. Very straightforward and clear and short sentences, which is interesting to me, and I enjoy reading that. I was saying the other day, similar kind of to passing, that it's nice, even though some of the things I might not understand because I am not of that time, the language is so simple that a lot of things you can, extrapolate. This will be the last book that I read for the 1900 to 1950 readathon, so I'm going to get on with that. It's crazy rainy, it's super cold, it was down in the 40s again, and I don't know what happened to the sun and the spring. So my spring vlog has taken kind of a circular turn. At the beginning it was just getting warm and sunny, and it had been rainy and cold, and it was still cold. It got hot and beautiful and sunny, and now it's rainy and cold again. So spring in New Jersey this year is all over the place. I don't know what to say or what to expect. It is very sunny out, and that is why I chose today to finish up the video. I finished the book of tea. It was good. It took me a little while to get through. It was very much like historically driven and philosophically driven, if that's a word. It definitely had a little bit to do with the actual tea processes, where tea comes from, and how tea is used in different cultures, and how the tea ceremony is done in Japan, and the significance of that in that culture. I really liked it. I really think this version is so adorable, and I was very lucky to get it used. It was written in 1906. I couldn't figure out who the translator was, but this has a forward and biographical sketch by Elias Grilly, so that might have been who translated this book. I'm not entirely sure, but I was also glad to read another translated work. For the 1900 to 1950 readathon, I read 5 books, and I hit, I think, all of the prompts. The prompts were read a book from your own country. I chose Nella Larsen's Passing. She was an American writer in the Harlem Renaissance. For the prompt read a book from a different country, I could go with almost any of the other books, but let's go with Out of Africa by Isak Dinesen, because Africa basically was a character in this book, and it was also obviously from a different country than my own. The next was read a genre classic, so I'm going to stretch this one a little bit, and I'm going to call The Loved One by Evelyn Waugh, which is a dystopian / speculative fiction, a genre classic. The next prompt was read a non-novel. I am going to count World War I British poets for this. This also completes the 5th prompt, which is read a book taking place during World War I or World War II. Finally, the last bonus prompt was read a book from every decade from 1900 to 1950. So for 1900 to 1910, I read the Book of Tea by Okakura Kakuzo. From the 1910s to 1920, I read World War I British poets. For 1920 to 1930, I read Nella Larsen's Passing, which was written in 1928. For 1930 to 1940, I read Out of Africa, which was written in 1937. For the last decade, the 1940s to 1950, I read The Loved One by Evelyn Waugh. I loved that the books I read were all so different, but they had a lot of common themes. There were a lot about kind of expatriates living in different countries and how you adapt to different countries. There was a lot about having to deal with political environments that you are not really happy with, and how otherness can be pervasive. It was really interesting how in Nella Larsen's Passing, you know, there were these two sides of the idea of passing and how that works and how you feel about your cultural heritage. It was interesting in World War I British poets that some of these poets were for the war and some were against. Out of Africa also took place during World War I, or parts of it did, and it was interesting to see people's views. Some people believed in the war and some people didn't believe in the war. It was interesting to read books where people were ingrained in new societies but were struggling to keep their cultural identities. It was interesting to see a Eastern take on looking at how the West doesn't really accept Eastern ways. That was similar to Passing, and that was similar to The Loved One. So it was crazy that all these books that I picked pretty much at random, only because of the years that they were written, had a lot of things that were the same in them and were referenced in each other and were educational for that time and interesting for that time and relevant to that time. And then also that kind of cultural and racial identity is really interestingly portrayed in some of these books. So I'm super happy with the diversity here. I have some British books that, of course, I love British writers. Those are my most read writers, so that's kind of normal. And then I have a Danish writer living in Africa and her take on the culture of Africa, but her Danish and English heritage and how she had to see this totally other culture through that. An American writer, although I read American writers, I don't often read Black American writers, so a Black American writer and their perspective on society at that time. And then a Japanese writer, a translated work. There was just a lot of diversity here, which there was a lot of common themes, there was a lot of different ideas, and I had a great time. I loved this 1900 to 1950 readathon, so I want to thank Books and Things for coming up with this, and I am going to make a plea to her to please do this again next year. There's so many books that she read and other people read who participated in the readathon that I have put on my want to read list. Did you participate in the readathon? If so, leave the books that you read in the comments below. If you've read any of the 5 books that I read and have some thoughts on them, please let me hear those as well. I would love to have a discussion about some of these books. This was super fun, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks so much. Bye!